Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters Podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now, before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow, or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now, here's what we've got for you today. Christian Morgner, welcome to the podcast. How you doing, brother?
Fine, thank you. Thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for taking time out of your busy day. The field and stuff that we're going to discuss today, and sort of everything you've been involved with through your career and through your academia and through your studies, is fascinating to me. And I think it's really crucial in helping us get a little bit more clout behind some of our theories, some of our thoughts, some of our concepts about how the world works, first and foremost, but also in the application that we're going to speak about today, how the role you've played in the emergency services. So for anybody that's unfamiliar, can you just give us like an introduction into the field of work that you are involved in?
So by training, I'm called a sociologist, which means I have an interest in the social or in society, which means I'm not really interested in what is going on in people's minds, but more how people interact with others. Because often, when we think about us or the world, we tend to say, oh no, it's me, acting or talking and so forth. But then when you kind of think about it, so what do we know, for instance, using the example here of this podcast situation, what do we really know about each other? So, do we really know what's your favorite music? What's your favorite color? So, what is your individual history? We don't really know anything, about what makes that particular individual. But we can, sit here, have this conversation without any problems. So, which means there must be something working beyond ourselves, beyond that, core individuality. And this is something I'm really interested in. What is that? So, what is it that brings people together, right? So, even those, they haven't really met each other beforehand and really, don't know much about each other's personal history.
Today's episode was brought to you by our good friends at Wood Watches. We put so much thought into the people that we partner with on the podcast, and Wood Watches has been with us since the beginning. Now, they have 6 different collections now. In October, they brought out their new Fearless collection. Now, I've been speaking to some people in the past who have got that Wood watch for a specific occasion, for something really smart, really classy. But the best thing about the Fearless collection is that it's built to be worn in active surroundings. Now, again, if you're unfamiliar with it, the massive core of all these Wood watches is the upcycling of firefighting materials. And the Fearless collection has got a 100-year-old British Brass firefighter helmet melted down and placed inside the crown of the watch. That's exactly the same as they have with all of their collections. But this one also features repurposed black fire hose. I myself went for the Valiant watch. I've had this for a couple of years now. Really nice. I've got it in the red strap. There's a whole range of payment options. Go over and take a look at them. Whether you're thinking of a retirement gift, you got something special to celebrate, or you have just started your emergency services career, go over and check them out. WilliamWoodWatches.com. The best way to support the podcast is to support our sponsors. So please take a click in the notes below. Now back to the show. How did you get an interest in that to start with? Because it sounds like you're speaking to the choir with me with that, because I always think that in society we have to make so many subconscious assumptions about the people that we're interacting with. Otherwise we just wouldn't do it. I think of driving as a simple example. Like, you drove and did some tasks this morning. I dropped my children off this morning. I drove here, and I was 8 inches away from total strangers traveling 70 miles an hour in the opposite direction. And I made lots of assumptions that they weren't just going to collide over and kill me. And we interact with people every day that we know nothing about, and really invest a lot of trust in the world around us. So why did you become fascinated with this?
I think something really goes back, I suppose, even to childhood. So I think in terms of growing up, so my mum was a nurse. Mm. And I think she was always the one interested in kind of the social side of things, right? Helping others, caring for others. Also worked for quite some time for her business. She had a caring business. Reading the newspaper to old people, cleaning their houses, doing like these sort of things. And then on the other hand, my father, he worked actually in social administration, but his background was in natural sciences. So he had studied physics. So from his end, he was quite interested in, the general laws, of physics and these kind of really broad and abstract questions. Yeah. And I always, found both of these areas really, really interesting, right? The kind of practical, hands-on kind of social stuff, caring and looking after people, but then also, still being interested in asking these very broad questions, where's the world coming from and why we're here and how does it all work, right? And I think at the time, I was kind of starting to search in terms of what I want to do after school. And so I went, simply we had a local library, and I went to the local library, and I remember, talking to the librarian and told her, look, I've got these two interests. Can you find me a book, right? And I remember, she looked at her computer and then said, look, we've got a book here. It's called Social Physics. And social physics basically was the, initial word that was used before we used the term sociology. So in the very early, 19th century, right? People started to think about society in terms of, its laws and, the kind of, broader sort of, structures of social behavior. Because, at that time, society was was undergoing a major transition from being like a very hierarchical society that was basically predefined through, religious cosmologies and so forth. Now, becoming very open, and we started to realize actually, we are making that, right? So, we are in charge. But then still people recognize, although it's not some eternal figure that is defining the rules, but we are doing it. It's still not, ending in chaos. So how is that possible?
Hey folks, just wanted to jump in with a quick piece around firefighter health and wellbeing. Whether you are trying to join the fire service and pass them tricky fitness tests, if you are currently serving, or if you are coming up to that next chapter of your life, retiring from the emergency services, we get so many different questions around it. So in partnership with Fitness for the Frontline, we have come up with a series of guidance and programs specifically designed to reflect the physical elements of the role of a firefighter. So whether it's carrying an LPP across an overgrown field, lifting a ladder above your head under running it, or wrestling with cutting gear for 30 plus minutes at some kind of complicated RTC, our bodies are required to lift, push, and carry objects in very specific circumstances. That is effectively what Fitness on the Frontline focuses on, as well as the longer term aspects of overall health and wellness for our firefighters. Now, we are definitely not about to be smashing out world records or getting that beach body ready in 6 weeks rubbish. The systems and programs that we put in place are adjusted for people's current fitness levels, and they're not a prescriptive weight or a one-size-fits-all BS. It is very likely for myself personally that I'm still going to be a firefighter when I'm 60 plus, so longevity in the role is really important to me, and I know it is for so many people out there. It all starts with no obligation, 7 days worth of the programming, absolutely free. So whether you're joining, serving, or looking at the next chapter in your life, Fitness for the Frontline is designed by firefighters for firefighters. Now back to the show.
You wrote a paper, Understanding Ethnicity and Residential Fires from the Perspective of Cultural Values. You did this around the East Midlands. Now, part of the premise of this paper was in relation to the different races and ethnicities and the devastating effect on these communities at events like Grenfell Tower. Why did you choose to focus on this? Because this seems like something outside of your field to an extent. Help us understand the connection firstly.
As a sociologist, I think one of the beauties is that because, your field of study is society, again, so, you can really study so many different fields, right? So you're not really restricted to just doing medical research or like understanding how medical practices have evolved. You can also do research on the media, on education, right? But also, so, on different cultures, right, on different state of societies. And one of the areas, or actually two areas of research I've always been interested in, is the world of risk and trust. So how it's like, what is the importance of trust in modern society, right? So why are people investing so much time in developing networks of personal trust, getting to know each other, but then likewise, so in these kind of more abstract contexts that we discussed, why do we trust the economy? So why does it work that we spend money and we believe it still works the next day?
Yeah,
right. And so so this has been one field of research I've always been interested in. But then also the other type of research, which was more related to institutional developments and institutional practices, were questions around diversity and inclusivity, because that was coming more from a management perspective. I've been asking, well, actually, are organizations, more effective, or let's say more, have a better understanding or better grasp of innovation and creativity if they're more diverse, right? If they, are able to incorporate a diverse number of opinions, because, there is a kind of field of thinking that says, creativity is something that requires diversity, requires different kinds of information that challenge our thinking, make us grow and beyond, right? So, and I think what you see here with this project is that they were kind of merged, right? So how do questions around trust and risk, in a sense, relate to these. So there was, really sort of, that kind of conceptual questions I had sort of in the background. How do they go together? But then likewise, I think it was at the time when we purchased a property, right? And at the time when we purchased the property, there were loads of questions around fire safety in that property which we purchased. And again,
I actually say that's a bit strange, because I don't think most people think about it at all. It probably says a lot about maybe your upbringing, or maybe just your awareness of your home or anything like that. But for most people, it's way down the list.
Yeah, potentially, Sophie, it was because before, it's partially related that before purchasing this kind of property, we lived actually for 2 years in Japan.
Okay.
Right. And so when we moved here, in order to have the property assessed, we had quite a detailed survey being done. And I remember the survey flagging that some of the insulation that we had in the garage, wasn't up to the fire standards in terms of, how long it would take in terms of, heat and temperature to last. And I remember, then I said, so what can I do about it? And the person said, just phone the fire service and have a chat and see what they say. Right. And I phoned them, and actually I had a really interesting conversation with the person at the time.
Yeah.
And that, in a sense, and kind of triggered and sort of, made me think, well, that's me and that's my understanding, but how does it work for others? And how does it really work? Right. And I think, from there, then I'd simply approach the Leicestershire Fire and Rescue Service at the time and said, well, so, do you have any kind of data in terms of fires and, people's understandings of that? Any kind of, quantitative data that you've collected from fire incidents? What kind of people sort of, have experienced that? And it was quite interesting to see that although sort of, the fire service had a lot of data in that sense, they had never really sort of, used it to that extent.
What do you think society, or how do you think institutional trust is valued in society now, and in the different countries that you've lived in, from your perspective in your profession? How do you think it varies, and what do you think it's like now for institutional trust?
I suppose, if, again, speaking from the perspective as a researcher, I think what is quite interesting is that we have to consider there are two types of trust, I would say, that are quite dominant in modern society. So there is the institutional trust, and there is what we call the personal trust. And although we use the word trust in both cases, they actually really work quite differently. So, for instance, with the institutional trust, it really is, it relies on very abstract principles, something that just has to work for us in order to trust into it. Whereas with a person, right, it is something that develops over a very long time. You really feel you get to know the other person. There's a lot of trust management, if you want to say so, involved. But then also that trust can be easily broken, right? I know someone having an affair, right? And all that trust you had built for 20 years evaporates within that second, and it's very, very hard to regain. Whereas with institutional trust, I mean, I don't know, a bank sort of, collapses, but think about, the enormous, financial problems that were in 2008 or 9. It wasn't sort of, that people gave completely up and, went into growing their own potatoes in their gardens or tomatoes.
We still put our money straight back in the next day.
So therefore you see sort of, there's a very different, in a sense, reliability when it comes more to institutions. And
why though? Because an institution is just a collection of individuals.
Yeah, you see, I think that goes back to the very early comment I made, that we often think it's made of these individuals. But think about an organization. I mean, imagine if that organization would just be in the heads of those people, the organization would die when they leave, right? But with most organizations these days, people are replaceable, right? So it's not that the organization collapses or dies as soon as these people are leaving and moving on, to do other things. So therefore you see something is at work here beyond their individual experiences, right? There are still certain structures in terms of membership, in terms of hierarchies, in terms of organizational principles that are still at work, and that's the same for any kind of institution. Right, so there are these broader principles, and we kind of work with them, we go along with them. Sometimes we criticize them because we like them to innovate. But at the end of the day, it's something that the actual individual isn't fully in control of, right? So from there, because otherwise, if you could on the one hand change it easily, and that could potentially be quite problematic. Or on the other hand, it wouldn't really give you that reliability that's needed in your everyday. And so therefore, I think coming back to your question, compare the institutional trust in these countries, it's quite interesting that it's fairly stable. Right, so there is, be it Japan or was it America or the UK, so people still think that democracy, let's say, is the best principle in the way we run
Do they?
Democracy. But the difference is what I said before, the kind of personal element, right? So there is like a very strong decrease in certain individuals in politics, in certain political parties. So what you see there is an increasing gap between what we call into institutional trust and the kind of more personal trust that we have into certain politicians or into certain political parties. Right? And the question is, and that's potentially from a research question, an unanswered one, is if that trust in certain political parties or individuals is declining to rock bottom, is that then in the end also impacting on the more institutional trust? Is it then leading to people to say democracy isn't the best thing anymore for politics? We should have very different forms in terms of how we organize it. And you see these elements, these cracks appearing there. The populism you see in certain parts of populism, the kind of extreme perspectives, right wing, left wing. You start to see that I'm not really buying any more into this principle, but one potentially knows something very different about it. So I think you see we're potentially quite at an important transition, right, where that kind of political or that kind of more personal element, right, in terms of parties and individuals is really challenged and is becoming increasingly problematic. Either people turning away, or you see these kind of more radical developments. Whereas I think, like I said, the institutional trust is still fairly stable, but the questions remains open where this is really going.
I like to think so, but because the emergency services lives as we are government organisations, so much of that does bleed over, and I worry sometimes that there is less trust in the NHS and the police. Obviously, egotistically and out of my own bias, I'm sure, I like to think that people still trust in the fire and rescue service, because I don't think we have a real motive. I don't think there's an obvious motive behind the fire and rescue service. We're fairly transparent. We always turn up to help people. I think when people think of the police, they can weave into their narrative this idea that the police are all against them, or it depends what you're doing. If you're doing something that doesn't adhere to the laws of the land, then the police are going to be your enemy. But it astonishes me most with the NHS and how much they get attacked and how much they get attacked either in the media or even physically on the streets. And I wonder why society is leaning away a little bit, it feels, from the emergency services. It feels that way to me sometimes.
I mean, trust was one of the key topics actually also for this research study. It was one of the key features, in a sense, when we did the community survey, that kind of in a sense demonstrated to us that there are very different principles at work, and these different principles in terms of trust that we just discussed, I think there wasn't like a great awareness on the side of the fire service about these kind of different workings. So I think on the side of the fire service, it was very much seen as it's purely that kind of institution, right? And we're here to help. So I think that was very much the approach. But then when you think about it, I mean, again, with help, right? Why should someone help you? Why should you call someone for help? Why is that the right institution? So you should phone to. I think as soon as you start to think about this one and dig a bit deeper, you start to see, it might be different, right? So it might not, there might have been people that grow up and that kind of more abstract trust and into these institutions was a fairly more normal experience, right? And therefore, if you've got a problem in your home, be it a fire or that kind of situation, it's quite normal. You would call the fire service. But let's say if you had grown up under circumstances where trust was something where you really needed to know the other person in order to be sure that you could rely on their help, then it actually puts the fire service to a certain disadvantage because they don't necessarily have that kind of personal approach to it, right? Yeah. So I mean, the only time really when you get to meet a firefighter is when you're potentially in a very serious situation, and that's maybe not the best situation to do trust building, right? Because everybody's going to be very busy and very stressed out. So therefore, you see, some of the services, again, when it comes to these different workings of trust, might then, depending on your personal circumstances, be in a more advantageous situation. So, for instance, was also something that we saw in the research that it's quite interesting that people would, put trust into the NHS quite highly. Okay. Much more than the police or fire services. And while we asked that question, we were also quite interested then to ask that question in more detail, and then, for instance, ask the question: so, what is your trust into the NHS versus, your GP or the ambulance? And then, you could actually see that people, then the kind of whole formula changed to a certain extent, because the trust in your GP and then the ambulance increased, whereas, the trust into the institution somewhat dropped. So within, the context of our study,
it became more personal.
Yeah, so the more personal element then was the thing that, in particular within the cultural context of this study, was that element that people really valued, right? And when you think about, you're unwell, right? You immediately have to see another person, right? It's something in terms of the setup of that organization, which is not really planned. It's, the ways of, we run, in a sense, cares of, in the Western world, is that it puts them at an advantage because you see your GP automatically. And there's also that tendency you probably see the same person again and again because, the way we allocate patients and all that works. And that's obviously really ideal, for building trust because you see the same person over time. You have that kind of chat and conversation. Whereas that, continuous engagement is something that isn't necessarily something the fire service can offer, right? So even if you come to school or you do some talk again, because of the way you run the structure of a station, with different kind of groups that operate them, there might be different people going to these events, or let's say you might have it all planned, but then I don't know, there is a call and then you can't attend it, and then it takes a fairly long time again to go back to that group. So it's a much greater challenge for an emergency service like the fire service to in particular build a kind of personal trust.
I think it's because it's personal trust is quite an intangible thing as well. So from an organization's perspective, it's hard to quantify or even justify doing certain things if there's not a direct correlating metric that I can see improve, if that makes sense. So unless we are consistently carrying out surveys, which we try to do, but it can also, even carrying out constant surveys can become quite impersonal, to be honest with you. So when we're going out and attending events and things like that, I see a tremendous value in it, and I that's kind of what I always thought about when I was a kid, is the fire service. We're at local events, they're at local fetes, the door's always open, you see them out training, they're just in your community. They should be seen as a source of good and moral value, and you can approach them and they're safe and they can help you in a variety of ways, not just when you're in an emergency. But I see less of a lean towards that sometimes when the argument is it doesn't increase any metric. I wanted to ask about, because there's been a number of public information campaigns that have sought to address these issues and by framing fire hazards in cultural context. For instance, one that we put into our sort of notes was in the UK in 2005-2006, the Deputy Prime Minister's office ran a fire safety awareness campaign that was promoted during Diwali, so the Hindu celebration, Eid for the Muslims, and the Chinese New Year festivals in 2008. The Fire Kills campaign referred to a survey of English housing which showed that smoke alarm ownership among Asian households was 10% lower than the national average. That leads us into the conversation around cultural differences and the need to adhere to social norms as things such as fire alarms and stuff like that. What was your perspective on reading that? Because it's something you include within your studies.
So I think on the one hand, what these initiatives and the evaluations of these initiatives are showing is, on the one hand, there is an increasing recognition that something has to be done, right? So it definitely isn't, a black hole on the side of the fire service that it's not being recognized. So you see quite a number of these initiatives across the UK, right? So over like a period of 20 to 25 years, where people have tried some of the things that you've mentioned, like providing free smoke alarms, running these awareness campaigns in ethnic newspapers. So quite a variety of different initiatives. But I think to a certain extent, the problem with most of these initiatives was, and that was therefore why we want to do it quite differently in this project, was that they didn't really go, so to say, to the core of the problem. So for instance, they recognized, let's say, that there was a difference in terms of smoke alarms, but didn't really ask why.
Yeah.
So why has like a a certain culture group fewer smoke alarms than the other? And that's not asking that question in a sense, then would cause further problems, or in a sense of would also mean that the kind of solutions provided in order to fix that problem weren't long lasting. So for instance, with that Asian community mentioned in this study was that then the fire service would go distribute and install thousands of like free smoke alarms, but then when they did an evaluation of this one, 5 years later, they would recognize, they've run out of batteries.
Yeah.
The batteries have been taken out. They weren't really functional anymore. And so you could ask, and then obviously, it might lead to a kind of like a negative backlash. But I would have said at the first, and try to understand why is that. So how do we incorporate smoke alarms in our household, and think about stuff. If you come, let's say, from a certain culture, for instance, where you use a lot of oil in your kitchen, it means you will produce a lot of smoke while you're cooking, and it doesn't mean it's unsafe, right? It's just part of your
something you've got to factor.
Stuff you've got to factor in. And part of the problem, for instance, with this initiative was, when you think about smoke alarms, there are two types. There are the heat alarms and the ones that recognize smoke, and they kind of mostly only installed the ones with smoke, which meant 10 times a day they would go on just simply because people were doing like their normal cooking, right? So in a sense of there wasn't also that sufficient understanding and trying to understand how does that culture operate, right? So what are their daily routines, right? How can actually smoke alarms or these types of smoke alarms create more problems than really solving problems? And then rightly so, then people would remove that distraction also
to
go on with that.
Fixes a problem once
daily
in
routines.
a lifetime. Do you know what I mean? And that's usually the worst case scenario, and it gets you and your family out alive. But if it causes problems every day and only fixes something once in a lifetime, it's just a hindrance. And like you say, you don't fix the why behind the motive.
Yes.
It's like teaching a person to fish versus giving them a fish. We're just giving people fishes, and they're not really understanding why they needed one or why they should have one. And then when it's finished or runs out of battery, the fish dies, they don't get another one.
Yeah. So therefore, I think with this project, it was really important to us to ask exactly these questions, because the data I've mentioned to you at the very beginning, the data I got from the fire service, was so in a sense, on the one hand, it kind of lacked all that culture or demographic information, but I could, to a certain extent, rectify that issue because I could relate that data to the national census. And so whilst merging these two data sets, it was actually possible for us to showcase that there are certain ethnic communities that have a higher likelihood to experience more fires, but especially also more severe fires, right? And at that time, we thought, it seemed almost like a culture issue, right? So, I don't know, something about the kind of cooking behavior or, the kind of culture understanding is causing that. But while we also looked at the data set, we had that one finding in there that was initially somewhat confusing, because what you would see is that people that lived in multicultural household were less likely to experience fires or less likely to experience severe fires. So it could even be someone who came from the same continent but from different countries, and they would live in the same household, and it would have a mitigating impact.
Yeah.
And we thought, well, that's quite strange, right? Because initially we would say, they're broadly coming from the same culture, right? That kind of reading into it. But how can it have an impact? And I think that very much changed the whole formula, in particular on my end, to say, well, actually, it seems it's not so much something about cultural behavior, but it seems more that it's about you stay, so to say, among the the same group of people, right? So it's very, we use in social sciences, you use the word as being very homogeneous, right? So, people coming from more or less the same background. And so we were then wondering, well, why couldn't that be a problem? And I think, so, then it leads to what we've discussed earlier on how we actually learn about fire safety and fire risks. And it isn't a formal subject that we learn in school. It isn't a formal subject that you learn at university. So in a sense, fire safety is just something you pick up as being, I don't know, a member of society. So, by being around, watching the news.
Half the time. I think of it the same way that I think of finances, because we don't really teach financial skills at schools either. We teach how to count, but we don't teach you about money. And you only really learn it when you make a mistake, when you get into an adult, when you go into an overdraft or anything like that. And I don't want to bash the education system. It's not an appropriate time to probably do that. But you have children in school. And like I say, we don't formally teach these life skills. We used to do stuff like, what do they used to call it? Oh, I can't remember now. What was it called? Where it was like, cooking was one of the things you would do in it, but it wasn't called cooking. It was socioeconomics. Is that what it was called?
Yeah, so some of these, there were obviously slightly more practical subjects in school, but I think the point I'm trying to make is that, there are certain types of, learning that are not necessarily integrated into formal school education, and there might be a good reason why that is the case. Why we think we can't do everything in school. I mean, curricula already really busy, and you hear teachers struggling to cope with all that knowledge, and if you kind of say, that is missing and that is missing, then it might seem so obvious, but it really is, I think, part of the core issue that we're seeing here with the trust that we discussed, with the learning, because I think, again, two different areas coming together. And again, I think if we're not understanding the complexity of how they work and actually know how they're really important for that kind of safety, then it's difficult to understand how people manage it or why they aren't really managing it. And like I said, with the fire safety, it isn't a subject that we learn through formal education. It is a subject we just pick up in that sense. But then that thinking then caused us to realize in the project was if that's something you kind of pick up because you're kind of like a member of society, what does it then mean for people that haven't grown up in that particular context, and especially that live in a community that, let's say, where most of the members of the community have the same knowledge as you are, right? So, and if you look at it then, from that perspective, then it doesn't become so much a culture problem anymore, but it becomes much more an information problem, because then the question is, why isn't that community receiving that information? Why are there certain barriers for them in order to pick up that kind of knowledge? So that was then, in a sense, how the research shifted from, let's say, initially in a slightly more, stereotypical understanding of how this issue is often treated, to say, actually, it's much more complex. The information is out there, but because of the shape up of that community, it seems it creates certain barriers, for people to engage with that kind of knowledge, to receive that knowledge, to know it's relevant, to know it's important to them. So therefore, then going back to this, then therefore we really wanted to ask, why is that? So why is it causing these barriers? So what is the problem behind that, and are these barriers really, really severe? And why we then in order then to tackle this, we did quite a wide-ranging community survey asking people about their understanding of risk behavior, if they had experienced a fire, how would they deal with fires, what is the role of smoke alarms, cooking behaviors. So really it was a very detailed study of ethnic communities broadly.
How did you do that? Because it's also a bit sad that the fire and rescue service weren't already doing some, I'm not saying they sit around doing nothing, but the fact that someone had to externally come in and do that.
Well, I think, to a certain extent you have to see that in terms of the research capacities of fire service, it isn't, and probably that has something to do with the institutional structure of these organizations. Research isn't really at their core. I mean, often you've got one or two people that work as a data analyst, and they already have to do all the reports. So asking them to do like a major survey or a major study like this, in terms of resources, it will be very difficult for them. But then potentially also in terms of the skills and knowledge, right, will be very difficult for them to do. And, historically, there's like the other issue that for some reason, fire services and universities haven't really collaborated much. So as once I started to look into this subject, you see actually there's a lot of collaboration between universities and the NHS, and there's a lot of collaboration between universities and the police.
Yeah.
But for some reason that culture never developed between fire services and the universities. So I think therefore in terms of the whole institutional setup, fire services are at this disadvantage that they haven't really able to develop these research capacities, even though they're sitting on a lot of knowledge, but therefore don't really have that in order to analyze it and shape it and do this kind of research. So therefore sometimes it might require an external person to kind of help with that.
It often only happens as a result of some sort of tragedy. I mean, we're seeing lots of marrying of resources in things like toxicology because of all of the toxins and things that firefighters and carcinogens that we're exposed to. That should hopefully act as like a little bit of a flagship to show the benefits of people that operate in academia and the tremendous value they can add and resources and willingness to do it as well. Because like you were saying before we came on, one of your interests in this, with the greatest respect to the other work that you've been involved in, you can see a tangible benefit in how it will improve society, how it will genuinely save lives, if we can act on the information that you produce. And I think there's so much of that can be leveraged more by, as you say, working more and building more bridges between those two silos as they are currently.
Yeah, I fully agree. However, I can also understand why this is potentially a bit of a sensitive subject for fire services. I mean, fire services have been under enormous pressure in the country, right? So many firefighters have been let go because of cuts and all of that. So, I mean, imagine there's this kind of external person who might be coming in and criticizing potentially what you've been doing.
What you haven't been doing.
Right. So therefore, it's, I don't know, Safina, is that something you should really do? Or is that you might even think, Safina, we're already doing the best we're doing. We're not really needing that external expertise because, there
that's
is
ego though. You keep your nose off to spite your face.
And like I said, Safina, because that culture in terms of collaboration hasn't existed for a very long period, you could also say that, likewise, what we discovered in the research, there's also that trust issue, right? So, and I think, with this, in particular with this project, I mean, initially when I started working with the fire service, there were mixed reactions to that, because on the one hand, people looked at the kind of data that were given to me and said, look, there's no problem, right? We hardly have any call outs to these to areas that are more dominated by ethnic populations, right? And there was also anecdotal evidence from some of the firefighters. I remember saying, we hardly go there, so it doesn't seem that there's an issue. So why doing that kind of research? Why investing into these kinds of resources? But then I think why I spent a lot of time within the fire service, doing loads of interviews with firefighters, but then also producing some really sound evidence, you could see that people's opinion would change and they would start to realize, okay, something about the way we approach this subject, right? So hasn't been able, or hasn't equipped us in a sense to see these problems. So for instance, just to give an example, in the survey we asked that question, have you experienced a fire in the last 3 years, right? And about 20% of the people said, yes, we had experienced a fire. So just in the last 3 years, not in their entire lifetime. Wow. And then we also asked the question, and in order to deal with that fire, did you call the fire service? And only 2% did. Right?
That's scary.
So you see, there's quite a difference in terms of actually people having experienced a fire and calling the fire service for help. And likewise, we also asked the question, well, who did you then call? And it was quite interesting that the majority were neighbors, friends, family. So again, people in your personal trusted network, and not necessarily the abstract trust that you see on the side of the fire service, right? And once, in a sense, we had produced that data, people could see, I'm very serious about it, I'm committed, right? I think that then, people could see as if it wasn't a kind of, criticism that I say something is wrong here, but it was like a collaborative project, and I worked with some really great people within the fire service, who made that happen. And also while I was doing these interviews, I met so many firefighters who had developed their own strategies, in a sense, to deal with this, to engage with communities and how we work. And I've seen so many really, really interesting examples. But then again, there wasn't at the time a kind of internal research structure to kind of harness that experience, right, with these kinds of firefighters. Some, they had done some really cool, awareness projects, videos and things. But again, that was very much down to the individual. And once that person would leave the fire service, they would take that knowledge with them. Yeah. So again, there were also these institutional questions in terms of how can we collect that knowledge, how can we collect that data that wasn't necessarily done at the time. So that's then also we're now creating part of the problems that in a sense you could say the understanding was there, right, but at a kind of very micro level, right, and not really shared. So in the organization, no broader training structures were developed for this. I mean, for instance, when you see firefighters, when I looked at some of the training figures, it's quite interesting that actually firefighters spend about an equal amount of time in terms of attending emergencies, fires or similar things. But then likewise, they almost spend exactly the same amount of what you might call public engagement, going to schools, going to festivals, as you mentioned before, providing leaflets and these kinds of talks. So in terms of the time, it's actually what you see is already quite equal. But then when you look at the training that is provided for firefighters to deal with this, there's a massive amount, right, to train how to put on your mask, how to deal with that pump. But there's almost zero training in terms of how can we be efficient at engaging with the public? How should we do that? What is a good strategy? What do we need to know about the public? How can we actually develop that kind of research culture to ask what is it that they want, right? What is their understanding of risks, right? So you see, there's also a bit of a lack of training to support firefighters in there. And that was something that was mentioned in most of the interviews, that people are very willing to engage, but they all said, we haven't been really given the skills, in order to do that.
I remember being in the fire service for probably 9 years before I ever even received any training on how to carry out home fire safety checks and how to engage in the community. And we do a series of awareness courses and things like that, for want of a better description, but I think it's very rare we're presented with any formal information or training about the priorities, the values of these different diverse communities. So as you sort of allude to there, most people are just winging it. How do you see us breaking down those barriers, or was there any evidences of particularly successful things that you'd seen used in different fire and emergency services?
Well, so I think, like I said, there were initiatives on the ground, more like, initial initiatives that worked really well. And I think it goes back in a sense to the problem with the trust that I mentioned, because, once we did the research, I mentioned the example that 20% had a fire, but didn't call the fire service. And that obviously increased. What was then really interesting for us, why is that the case? So if you said early on, you have this impression yourself, the fire service is there to help people, so having that kind of very positive self-image on that side, but then people wouldn't pick up on it, right? And like I said, I think part of the social structure in these communities is that the way you organize your social world or you organize your social life is very much driven by these, much more personal networks, right? So the way you find a job is through, some of your networks. The way, you go for shopping and meet others. And even so, to a certain extent, think about relationships and marriage. A lot of this is facilitated through these personal networks. So it's very much, how can you say, the Amazon peer review principles, that really works here, that you have that scrutiny through your community and the people well, that you rely on their opinion and you rely on their expertise. And I suppose that is something we also find in many areas of life. You've got that trusted best friend, and if that person is saying, maybe Pete, you should potentially do that quite differently, you will really listen to that friend. Whereas, if some person on telly, might say that, you might think, how is that person, like relevant to me? Or, how dare sort of, you're suggesting that. So you see sort of, how trust, can make a huge difference in terms of people, taking information very seriously. And so why we then look at the research is we then also ask, how is the fire service engaged with these communities? And what we see is that the kind of engagement concept on the fire service is very much this sort of institutional top-down concepts of, dropping flyers, talking at communities. But there's very little in a sense of understanding who they are,
talking
right? Talking, working with them. Right, so and that doesn't necessarily mean, and I think that is part of the training that we then develop. That doesn't necessarily mean in your first encounter, I'm telling you, so what you shouldn't do in terms of to keep yourself safe. But it's much more getting to know each other, right? So I don't know, just going to a service, being there, showing your face, being there on a fairly regular basis, and it can just be like an hour of your time.
Police are a lot better at that. You see them just showing a presence, as they would say it, at community events, at mosques, at religious occasions, and not wanting to do that kind of smash and grab approach that we have been guilty of in the past, where we go and we've got a clipboard. I want your number. I want your email address. I want your information. I'm going to come see you at your house. It's just having that sincere interest. But again, and I don't know how they're doing it. Did you have any contact with police or NHS around how they justify it? And not even that you should have to justify it, but
but the example with the police is, they've been, and it was quite interesting and to a certain extent also shocking when we did the research, that the police actually, when we asked that more personal element, came actually out higher in terms of their trust than the fire service. Because when you think about changes in the structure of the force over the past 10 years, and a really important invention, it was something people acknowledged in the survey, was the development of the community police officer. Right, so as like PCS you say, service. That face, that is constantly there. But then I think, the force has potentially also been at an advantage because it tends to be more diverse, right? So historically, the way it has developed, fire services still tend to be quite white male when you look at the statistics of very much in a sense not having that diversity, and not having that diversity then also creates a bit of a disadvantage, because what we've seen, I interviewed some police officers in Leicester and the region that did some great projects, and then asked, well, how could you do that? And they already had the people, in a sense, in the force that had these connections with the community because they were recruited from these communities, and then still had these links. So it was a lot easier for them to build that, right? They didn't really need to, build that trust from scratch, right? They didn't really need to invest in that kind of engagement. It was something that was just there, right? And they could, harness, in a sense, that expertise, and therefore build it and then work with the communities. So again, that really helped them with a lot of the work. Whereas on the fire service, some of these elements yet didn't exist.
We spend most of our time inside our stations as well. As I'm hearing you talk there, I'm thinking so much about, I'm trying to envision that police community support officer. They're out on the beat all the time, and you couldn't be able to quantify the million different fingerprints they would have on them because of all the different social interactions that they have, just by the sheer fact that they are in the community more. We tend to go out and do a task and then retreat back to our fire stations, close all the doors, and that's it. Unless you saw us in passing wherever we were, we don't tend to patrol. We're not out there as much. And I suppose that sounds like I'm trying to justify our actions, and maybe I am in a way, but unless we consciously put ourselves in those environments more and more, it's going to be hard to change that.
Well, it's quite interesting actually when you look at the history of the fire service in a bit more detail, because it used to be quite different. Fire stations, I wouldn't necessarily know exactly the time frame, but even when you look at, for instance, in Leicester, it's Central Station, I believe, the kind of older building. It used to be a public place, like in the top floor. That big room used to be a dancing hall, right? And they had their own bar, because a lot of the people that lived in the area before they would go into town they would go to the fire station, right, for kind of like a social event. So in that sense, fire stations were much more open, right? They were much more social spaces where it was very normal for the community to go to, right? But over the years of, and maybe so, this is also related to the complexity and the expertise, maybe also, to cuts of, in terms of accommodating external people, that has become, less and less a possibility. So therefore they've become more closed spaces, right? And people, so, wouldn't use them for that reason anymore. So therefore, I think, we see, so, a need within fire service, as you say, so, to be more out there, right? To kind of show your face, right? And with that kind of, showing your face, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean always, to offer, advice, at the first instance, but it is, building that trust of, showing, we are here, we are reliable. And if people then have a question, they actually will do it, they will pick up on it. So, once they get to know you, then, they will engage, and then they feel like there is that other person I can trust, and I can ask them questions, because there's also a lot of fear that we've seen with some of the examples that people then would say to us, we didn't call the fire service because we were afraid they might charge us for it. So that was a very common question we heard. So there was this kind of anxiety in a sense, but then maybe some were also like anxious in a sense that the fire service, you had a fire, right? And the fire was, let's say, cooking related. Then a lot of people believed, well, I caused the fire, it's my fault, right? So if I call like an external institution, then they might tell me like it was your fault and you will be prosecuted for that. Or I don't know, Yusuf, will come to harm because you actually invite, someone into your home who will then say, look, it was your fault. So there's quite a variety in terms of understandings, why then also people think, and also there might be this question asking for help, right? So there could be different approaches to that. So maybe you should actually deal with this. You should be in charge. You should be able to control that and so forth. So there's quite a different variety and understandings that then so forth, prevents in a sense why people might not engage with the fire service. But I think what all of this shows is that there isn't that trust, right, to ask these questions in the first place. Because I mean, if you're with a good friend, you can ask them slightly anything, like, and even tough questions, right? But if you don't really have that relationship with that other person, I don't know, you're a bit left to your own, I don't know, understandings and what you imagine, so who they are and what they think and so forth. And that's not really ideal, but I think it kind of showcases that bridge I mentioned earlier on, that lacks of, that communication between, these communities and the fire service isn't really there. And therefore, that the priority should be to try to develop these and build these bridges. And this is, what the research, wanted to do in order to showcase how can we build these bridges? What is it? And so as a result of this, one of the elements was that we built quite a detailed training that was integrated into the training pathway of the fire service.
Was that locally or nationally?
That was locally.
Okay.
That was locally. And
what was the response like when you presented these results back? Were they astonished? Were they offended? Were they thankful?
It was an overwhelmingly positive experience, right? So everybody, I've met, and I presented that research at all levels of the fire service, at middle managers, at the very top, local firefighters. I mean, towards the end, I had so many presentations just to showcase the results, and everybody said, this is so valuable, this is so important for us.
If they do something with it, though.
Well, if they do something with it, and I mean,
not saying that they haven't.
And I mean,
I don't know. But
part of the research was, and I think this is like, it comes back to what I said at the very beginning. I mean, I just didn't want this project to end by saying, look, here's the data, these are results, now deal with it. Because we often see what happens is that reports of is ending up in someone's drawer and then never seeing daylight again. So therefore, it was impertinent from the very beginning that I wanted to develop, let's say, a number of tailored outcomes, tangible outcomes that were really useful for the fire service. One of them was the training tool that we developed. So, like I said, I wasn't only doing the community survey, but I was also running internal surveys within the fire service. When I met with firefighters over breakfast, I asked, can you remember like a training you had that you really enjoyed, that was really useful, you really learned a lot? Why was that? Why did it work so well for you, right? And, what a lot of people said is in terms of what you said with the home fire safety checks. Oh, it was just PowerPoint presentations. It was a bit dry, whereas a lot of people said, we had been, I still remember, there was a training on that particular pump and it was so tangible and practical, and I learned so much from it because you're really doing it, right? So therefore, part of the engagement training that we developed was a bit of a mix of these things. So there was a bit of context in terms of some of the research findings, just to make people think there is something going on. But then there was also a lot of practical stuff people had to do in terms of reflective exercises, in terms of doing a diary, in terms of collecting bits and bobs of information on their own within their networks, but then also doing small projects, going actually into these communities and applying that kind of knowledge, and then coming back and having internal training workshops to share best practices. How has it worked for you? How has it not worked for you, and so forth, to really make it as applied and practical as possible. So, and there was also an element, means of training other firefighters in order to deliver that training to others, because there are more than 600 firefighters within the fire service. I couldn't train them all, so there was also this element of training the trainers involved. And I think I quite like this idea, because it would enable the fire service to develop this on their own, right? Because again, the other danger is you bring in this consultant, they do this training once, and then again it evaporates after the funding has run out. So I think it was also really important that this project is sustainable. It's integrated into the normal training pathways, is something that will exist also in the next few years, and not just until this project has come to an end. So I think this was really one element we developed. The other one was also around corporate communication, because as part of the research, like I said, the personal element was really important. But then when we actually looked at some of the corporate communication, let's say flyers, let's say posters and so forth, and we compared that, for instance, with the NHS, what we noticed was that all that communication within the fire service was very abstract and didn't actually include any pictures of firefighters. I'd say, quite ironically, pictures a bit of doom and gloom, so with fires in there and burning houses and then loads and loads of information in there, right? So there was no personal connection you could build, through that corporate communication.
People buy from people. You've got to put people in the picture.
Yes,
so they can identify with somebody.
And even not the communities, the kind of customers or service users weren't in there. Right, so therefore I think then we also hired I worked with an ethnic photographer, and we took a number of firefighters to go to the communities and then work with members of the communities to do a number of really interesting photo shoots, did some interviews with them, some quotes, and then created a really different type of visual communication that people could really relate to, in terms of the people that were in these images, how we engage with them, and so forth. To, in a sense, showcase what firefighters are actually doing, right? Because they're actually doing all that, but for some reason it never made it into the corporate communication. So, producing these flyers was then also producing that kind of imagery was then also something to give back to the fire service. And because, as you know, often firefighters are actually in charge in producing that. It's not necessarily, it's something that is being designed at the top of the organization, but actually it sits something very much at the local level. So it was also really, giving that inspiration. How could you do it differently? How does the community see it? How are they incorporated into the images? Again, in order to equip them, that if they have to develop it in the future, working with other communities, how could this be done? How could it look like? How did we, do it? And is that something they could also incorporate into their best practices? So these were, I think, initially two of the elements that we gave back as quite tangible outcomes to the fire service, plus then the report and quite a number of recommendations that refer then also more to what I said before, the institutional or internal structures, in terms of how could that knowledge, right, that people have on the ground being better collected? How could it be better shared, right? Across, for instance, let's say, you've got the Blue Watch that tends to be more the kind of community sort of, oriented watch. But then, I mean, likewise, sort of, others, be it green or sort of, some of the others, they might also benefit from this, right? But there isn't really a kind of horizontal structure within the fire service where these firefighters would necessarily come together and share that. So I think, part of the recommendations also included to think about this. And I'm really pleased to say that it was really taken on, and they've employed now new people to deal not only with this from an external perspective, that is something you often see, but then also employ people that deal with this from an internal perspective, right? Have someone who oversees these processes, giving a platform to that kind of knowledge. So I think there have been a number of very positive outcomes from this project.
Because you've got to truly apply those resources to it, otherwise you're just giving it lip service, aren't you? And if nobody's championing it, if you don't actually appoint somebody in these positions, it's not going to execute. It's not going to have that longevity and truly be sustainable. Because I think now, as our communities only expand, but the level of diversity remains the same. Like you say, if we don't build those bridges, I almost think of it like distilling alcohol. If those communities don't interact outside of the community, don't interact with the emergency services, certainly with the fire service perspective, as those generations continue, it's only going to distill and become more isolated and more purified. And it will be even harder to break through those barriers at those points if we don't act on it now.
Absolutely. I mean, it was something that we even saw in the research, because we didn't just only survey, let's say, the current population. I mean, we could see in terms of how that knowledge was passed on from one generation to the other, that in the survey we covered 3 generations. And it was even with the third generation that there was this kind of lack of trust.
Really?
Yeah. So it definitely is something that is passed on from one generation to the other. And like I said, I mean, if you're able to sustain, a lot of your life within that community, how could this develop? Why should you? And if the fire service isn't really seeing that because they haven't done that research, they aren't able to intervene or build these bridges, so along that way, right? And then integrating that knowledge and making also part of people's everyday life. Because like I said, the way we learn about fire safety is through sort of like kind of this very general communication, and not through sort of some sort of formal education.
As we sort of come to a close, I wanted to sort of zoom back out and ask what sort of other societal challenges you think you're looking at now. What are some of the things that fascinate you most about society now, and some of the challenges that we're facing? Because this is only one of an entire, buffet of challenges that we're facing.
Yeah, so I think at the moment I'm working on 2 other projects. One is more related to questions around ecological issues, and the other is more related to people with dementia. Wow. So the one with the ecological issues, again, it shares some of the features of this research, because although, let's say, using the example of climate change, we often think that climate change is something very global, right? And therefore, because it is so global, it applies the same to everyone. But, like I've mentioned before, I lived in quite a variety of different countries around the world. And, based on that experience, I started to realize that people's understandings of nature, environment, ecology isn't necessarily the same that I have. I mean, even when you think about what kind of image pops into your head when you think about nature, to some is the forest, to some is the ocean, to some is certain animals, certain sounds, and so forth. And all these, in a sense, differences then also impact on their understanding of risks of the environment, right? So, for instance, let's say if your understanding of the environment is it should be peaceful, it should be for relaxation, right? Then, in a sense, the dominance of policies then you find in that country will be it shouldn't be touched, right? It should be conserved, and so forth. Whereas, in other countries, you might see that, nature is more a provider, right? Nature is where we go to have fun with our families, with our children, to play, where you find food for lunch, where you get together. So therefore, if you would tell them you shouldn't touch that, it wouldn't work for them, right? Because there's a much more balanced approach to how people incorporate nature into their daily lives. And as part of that research and these different understandings, then I wondered, well, when we go to these big climate conferences like the COP26 that we had in Glasgow, to what extent is that diversity of understandings and the impact on policies be taken into account? So I went actually to the COP26 and was a little bit shocked in a sense that isn't the case. So there isn't really a conversation about our different understandings, and I felt if that is not taken into account, well, potentially we don't really need to be surprised that once we come up with some targets or international legislation, but then it's virtually impossible to implement it in certain regions where that doesn't apply to.
Yeah.
Right. So therefore, I've been working over the past 6 months on a project, trying to produce like a guideline for those to work in this field. How can we take this diversity of understandings into account? How can we improve international environmental legislation, to make it more efficient, to make it more applicable, so that people in a variety of different regions can actually apply it, and therefore make it more sustainable and successful. So this is one of the elements in terms of the issues I've been really quite interested in. And then the other one I've mentioned is, and it's been something I've been working on for quite a while now, is more related to people with dementia. So again, a bit of a group that, if you want to say so, tends to be slightly excluded. Right, there's a lot of stereotyping in terms of what that means, in terms of that illness, the way we again imagine this, and again, so when I started to work into this field, it was really surprising to see the complexity of life and communication that people sustained, even though they had dementia. Right, so which is very different in a sense from potentially the public
There's lots
understanding.
Of different types of dementia as well,
yes,
the way it affects your life.
That we had and so forth. But while I was working on that project, there's one topic that for some reason always came up, that people talked about pain, right, and the role of pain. And I started to wonder, why is that? Why is it so frequently mentioned? And at the time, actually,
physical or psychological?
Yeah, both types. Both types of the kind of mental stress you have, let's say on the side of the carer, for looking for someone 24/7. But then also the person themselves. So that this was an issue, and actually at the time it coincided that I had quite a severe sports accident and was for 6 months in quite severe pain myself. And so while I remember at the sports clinic, I remember the medical staff would often ask me, so how would you rate your pain today? Is it this, a 7? And you would get these surveys, and then with these pain questionnaires, I don't know if you've ever seen them, and they can easily be like 120 words long, and you look at them and you think, well, what does it mean, and how is that different from the other, right? And then you have to look at this the next day, and you start to realize, I can't really compare that. So using these questionnaires, and you start to realize that it requires a lot of verbal skills in order to explain to another person that is my pain. Right, and that then would lead me to the question.
That's a great point. Sorry to interrupt you there, but like you say, because it brings my mind back, and I'm not trying to go back to different subjects, but that limitation of language is tremendous, because if you only have one or two ways of saying something, your ability to articulate your feelings about pain, about safety, about friendship, about trust is very limited, and it kind of narrows our vision and our ability to communicate so much. Sorry to interrupt, but I think that is a really distinctive point I hadn't thought about until you just said it.
And that's the point why it is then so difficult for people with dementia, because although in our general understanding, we often associate dementia as the kind of memory loss disease, but actually it also means that people's linguistic skills decline over time, and that goes both ways. So that on the one hand, they are unable to verbalize their thoughts, certain words just disappearing, and for whatever reason you can't remember them. But likewise, it also works the other way around, that people would talk to you, you couldn't recognize these words, right? So you can't associate meaning to them. So it really becomes over time very, very challenging to communicate with others. And if you then, bring these two areas together, that actually pain, as you said, requires quite a sophisticated element of communication. But then you have this linguistic decline. It creates a severe challenge for people with dementia and people who walk into this field who deal with this. And you see then quite severe consequences that on the one hand, it's not being treated properly, right? Which then leads to aggression. You've been in pain all the time, and the kind of pain medication you've been given is far too less because you can't really verbalize it, or the people on the other end can't really decipher it. It might lead to anxieties because you might think, oh God, is the pain coming again, and so forth. Or on the other hand, you might also see that it's been overrated, and then people are nearly sedated. You go to care homes and you see, people in wheelchairs are not really able to talk or really do anything. And again, because too much has been given, and again, because you couldn't really properly assess it. So therefore, as part of the project, we wanted to understand how can we develop a better understanding of pain for people with dementia. So, in order to come to, training, treatment procedures that would be more targeted, more efficient, and delivering this kind of care. And I think, that in a sense in itself, would lead to a number of really, really interesting results. That, for instance, when it comes to pain, right, we often think it's a very individual thing, right? I'm having this and it's my pain. But then, like I said, if communication becomes so important in order to verbalize it, it means it also delegates a lot of pressure on the other person, because are they actually able and equipped to decipher it, right? And
it's like when your child's crying and you don't know what's wrong. Yes. I can't understand you. What's the matter? And you're trying to solve their problem with all the tools that you think they need, but I can't understand you. I don't know what's wrong.
Yes, and then again, when you look at training of let's say staff at dementia care homes and so forth, I mean, none of them has been given any specialized training on pain, how to recognize pain and so forth. So you see, there is that ability to communicate, and that we've seen with the fire service, right? It becomes, and also with the environmental stuff and the different understandings, equipping ourselves with really good communication tools becomes so important in modern society. And then maybe that goes back to something that we've discussed at the very beginning, that we have this feeling that we can't really rely on pre-given meanings, but the tool actually we have, and maybe this is creating much more reliance on this, is actually communication, because it's that tool through which we can share, through which we can create that common sense and that meaning. So therefore we really need to be at our game and upgrade our skills in that area, in order to stay top of the game at a society that's changing at a very fast pace. So that once these situations arise, we can actually communicate and rely and have the kind of sharing ability, so that these common meanings can be created and we know what we are talking about, and therefore address these challenges.
I think that is a great place to finish, because that overwhelming desire to develop our communication skills, because I always say that whilst we've never been so connected in society, we've also never felt so alone. We have lots of fast food conversations that are very shallow, and I almost think that's why we've seen the growth of things like podcasting, because people crave that in-depth communication because they're not really given it. People don't feel listened to. Echoing back to the dementia aspect, people don't feel listened to, feel heard. And I worry that as we delve more into the world of technology and social media, it can come at a cost of being less able to articulate our thoughts and communicate our feelings.
Absolutely. So I think communication is like really key in a sense to how we can relate to others, how we can try to understand them, how we can make sense of the world. So, and obviously, like you say, it's changing with different communication technologies, with knowledge being changing. So therefore, we can't also take communication, or those we seem to be so easy to do it, taken for granted. No, right? It is something. It is something that requires a lot of development and understanding in our everyday life. The way we communicate with our children, the way we communicate with our partners, and then also professionally, how we communicate at work, how we communicate our research and so forth. So it's a very important topic in a sense that stretches across all these different projects that I've mentioned to you. And I think that really shows there is a very pertinent area that is really applicable to us in a quite variety of different scenarios, settings, and so forth. And therefore, staying on top of that, I think it's really important.
I think that is going to be the key to be able to sustain an effective society, is our ability to keep communicating. Frequency, doing it often, and not being scared of making mistakes. I think sometimes we lean away from communication because we're scared about offending or upsetting people. But I think we increase the likelihood of doing so if we don't talk at all. That's the real danger for me. Christian, I found that absolutely fascinating, brother. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to be here with us. I'd love to have you on again at some point in the future, actually. I've got a feeling you're going to delve down several rabbit warrens of society, and I'd love to touch base again and maybe find out a little bit more about one of them as well.
That'll be my pleasure. Thank you so much, Pete.
The Firefighters Podcast is a global podcast seeking to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operators. Through a series of wide-ranging conversations celebrating those within our sector, we seek to encourage and support this incredible group of people. It's brought to you by myself, operational firefighter Pete Wakefield, and I speak with individuals from all walks of life who I sincerely believe can add value to or develop those who have chosen this life path. Please support your emergency services wherever you are in the world, and thank you for listening.